Welcome to Recovery Point's Disaster Recovery Tech Talk. Recovery Point is a pure-play provider of end-to-end cyber resiliency and disaster recovery solutions. So disaster recovery is our main mission in life, and we wanted to share our knowledge with the IT community at large because whether you're just starting your disaster recovery research or looking to level up with your existing DR program, we can help. These videos are designed to review software and hardware tools and technologies as it relates to building a successful disaster recovery solution. Today, Eric is going to discuss Veeam immutability strategies and how to defend against ransomware. Then he'll demo some real-time recovery scenarios using Veeam with instant recovery via LHR and the S3 object storage. And then he's going to show us how malware scanning runs in action using YARA rules, along with Microsoft Defender. I'm Jeff Judy. I'm the Disaster Recovery Chief Cloud Architect for Recovery Point. And again, today we have Eric Black. Hello, Eric.
Hi, all. I'm Eric Black, a Senior Solutions Architect here at RPS, Veeam subject matter expert.
All right. Eric, take us through the key takeaways.
Why immutability matters. Immutability options, Linux hardened repository or S3 object lock for backup. We'll cover how to reduce storage costs with Veeam's deduplication and compression in S3. How to execute instant and full recovery VMs in a hybrid environment. We're going to demo that. Malware detection, recovery using YARA rules, and Microsoft Defender or other third-party tools along with Veeam Threat Hunter. And then we'll cover cleanroom recovery for safe and isolated testing.
Awesome. This sounds like a good lineup. So let's just set the stage for a second and talk about the case for proactive backup recoveries. Some of this information we pulled from the Veeam 2025 Ransomware Trends and Proactive Strategies report. And it said that 89% of organizations had their backup repositories targeted by threat actors. And 34% of those backups were either modified or deleted. And 51% of the companies out there that were attacked, they were able to recover the majority of their servers, which leaves 49% of you out there in a bad spot after a cyberware attack. And, you know, like a scenario that you can really think about here is one where maybe you have some clients and they get, they're hacked, you know, and the attacker gains access. They come in, they encrypt all the data, and they also delete your Veeam backups. You start to assess the damage and realize that, you know, they didn't have immutability. They had no offsite secondary copies of backups. What you know, that's a really hard lesson to learn at that point. What you have to realize is that cyber attacks are going to target your backups. They may gain access, elevate permissions, and try to change your retention policies inside the Veeam console or whatever data mover you're using today. They often delete or try to encrypt the backups, and then that allows them to increase pressure on you to pay the ransom. So you have to build against that, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Cyber resiliency backup validation. So Veeam Intelligence through Veeam they recently released or introduced a data resiliency maturity model, and that helps to measure an organization's resilience practices against the number of factors that we're going to speak about today. It's a great framework to start reviewing. And in our graphic today, I mean, step one is the backups. You can't recover if you don't have any backups. That's just a fact. The backup infrastructure itself is going to be attacked. I mean, there's a good reason that one of the first things that gets attacked during a cyber event is the backup infrastructure, because you're more likely to pay money and less likely you are to restore and recover your own systems. So follow the 3-2-1 rule of backups to help protect. Make sure that you have offsite copies, different media for a copy. And this is a critical foundational step to having your data and applications protected. And of course, we're going to talk about immutability. Eric's going to take us through that too as well. And, you know, that really means that they cannot be altered and they can't be deleted. And that's simply table stakes when it comes to making sure the data is there when you need it. Of course, you need extra protection where possible during actual backup process, and that's starting with, you know, a source example was Veeam has a great malware detection tools for monitoring system activity ransomware signatures as part of the backup process. And that's the malware scanning Eric's going to show us today as well. It's a great complement to the already existing security platforms you may have in place. After you take backups and they're completed, you want to make sure that they're good. Traditionally, the best way to know for sure is to actually do the restores. You're going to go through the whole process and know what and find out that if your backups are good. So if you're partnering with us at Recovery Point, we do ongoing testing of all of our clients' backups with a combination of restoration, scanning, and data validation. And of course, none of this matters if you don't have a way to report on the findings or the various metrics, which ultimately can lead to knowing if your remediation is required. But everything starts with the backup and immutability. So Eric, you're working with our Veeam clients every day. Can you take us through why immutability is important?
Sure. So we can start with, the purpose of immutability. Immutability protects backup data from being deleted or modified. And it's a critical defense against ransomware and malicious actors. With Veeam, we have two options. We have a Linux hardened repository, which I'm sure some people have heard of. It's been around for a while now. And that particular option leverages the use of Linux file systems, specifically XFS, to make things immutable for you. It's enforced with the Linux chatter I command, which marks files as immutable at the OS level. You have to have root access to that particular machine to do anything at all, even to view those files, things like that. The best use case for that is typically on site. It's fast. Local recoveries are a part of that. It protects recent backups stored on a hardened Linux server for you. Immutability, like I said, can't be bypassed without root access or file attribute modification with that particular one. The biggest difference between LHR, other than it being on site and faster disk, there's no reliance on external systems or cloud APIs. So when we contrast that with S3, it leverages the object lock, and the majority of that is all cloud API driven. The mutability mechanisms for that S3 object lock use, you have the option of compliance or governance mode. Veeam communicates directly with the object storage API to set the retention periods for you. An ideal use case when we start talking about S3 is typically offsite backups, air gap protection, long-term archival is a real good one that it's typically used for. The cloud advantage over LHR, it prevents accidental or malicious deletions even from compromised Veeam servers. So there's relatively no way to delete anything that's immutable on your S3. It's significantly up in the cloud. It works really well with the 3-2-1 backup strategies, and of course we mean 3 copies, 2 media types, 1 off site. And those are the two main difference. So if you had to do a contrast of, well, which direction should I go? LHR for performance and rapid recovery, and S3 object lock for resilient offsite storage is pretty much where we typically land on those things. Both can be used together in a tiered strategy for maximum protection. So when we talk about Veeam sobers, we can set up extents, some of those being on LHR and then offloaded to S3 as well. And so you end up with, 2 copies of Immutable, which is great.
Yeah, seems like you could, if you had to pick and choose, always good to have the best practice to get a copy of that data off site and use S3, but maybe you could have the best of both worlds and keep a LHR local in prod and then get that backup copy off site as well.
Absolutely.
So if you're using S3, walk us through what the block generation is all about.
Okay, so let's talk about what block generation is in the context of Veeam. So block generation refers to how long blocks of data are grouped together before a new generation is started. So when we talk about that in context, fewer generations equals fewer metadata indexing operations, which ultimately results in much better performance. So those default block generation periods that are built in, typically we see things 30 days for like Amazon or IBM cloud storage. A lot of the local stuff and or Wasabi Backblaze, those kind of services, they're 10-day block generation period. And so Part of what's built into that too, or what Veeam does with that block generation period, is to minimize the IO on deletion processes as well. So if you had a bunch that were expiring, a bunch of backups that were expiring, and they were expiring all at the same time for removal, we obviously don't want those removals to impact the writing aspect of S3 for current ongoing backups. And so it builds in this block generation period to help manage that IO and kind of control that garbage collection that S3 devices do. You can think of it as like a queuing system, basically, with a 10-day or a 30-day expiration on it. Why it matters really is that, like I said, it reduces the IO operations. Fewer block generations means fewer operations, right? So all helps when you start talking about the cost of S3 storage and how that works. And overall, it lowers the storage cost. Less frequent writes reduce the put, copy, delete operations, which when we talk about AWS and things like that, they're billable, right? We all know that those are billable. The API calls, those are billable. So this is an effort, on Veeam's end to help reduce the overall cost and minimize storage usage.
Yeah, and of course, we're not going to, if you're sending data to our S3 storage at recovery point, we have there's no charge for the egress fee or the API calls. You can skip that altogether.
Absolutely. Yep. And the bottom line, Veeam intelligently extends the block generation window. It's, based on the storage, kind of to strike a balance between cost efficiency and backup chain performance. And so that's the idea behind it.
Mm-hmm. So if you're building a synthetic after you're full, it's still pulling from the blocks that have already been uploaded, the change blocks up in.
Correct. And that's a very good point. And so when we talk about immutability, Veeam in and of itself is leveraging synthetic jobs for that, not to add additional chains to it. And so it derives the delta and then it builds upon the chain that's already there, reducing, the overall storage cost and space yet again.
Mm-hmm. I really like that.
Yeah,
All right.
it's a great feature.
Yeah. All right. So, what about the recovery process?
So Veeam has a couple different ways of recovering things, right? And most people typically understand the full restore option. We rehydrate, in typical form and fashion, block for block. We put all that back. Typically, those, they take the time that they take, but they can take obviously a lot longer than, say, instant recovery. And so when we talk about instant recovery in a scenario, where you might want to use instant recovery is if you have something down and the immediate need is really just to bring that server back up, get it online, and get it going as quickly as possible. And so Veeam allows us to leverage this instant recovery option. And what that does is it basically prepares your VM and gets it ready and boots it directly out of backup files just to get it up and running. And so there is a little bit of an IO hit there, obviously because it's running out of backup files, but again, it's up and running in a matter of minutes. And once you've gone through that, you can then migrate that over completely behind the scenes. So your server will be up and running, you'll be serving data. And then on top of that, it's going to do the migration for you of the rest of those blocks as it would a full restore behind the scenes while that server's still up and running. One of the other use cases that you might use instant recovery for is if you need to scan something for malware. You boot it up in an instant recovery scenario. It's not claiming all this extra space as a full restore. It doesn't take nearly as long to get to testing. Or likewise, you could think of it similar to using like a FLR status or a file level recovery too. Say you had a database server and you needed one file off of it or one database off of it. So you could do that instant recovery, get it up and running, log into it, copy that file out to wherever you need to, and then bring that back down just the same without taking up a whole lot of additional space on your vSphere as well. So a couple different use cases that make it very useful.
Yeah. I like it. I like it because we can quickly validate backups are working.
Yes,
When we
very much so.
run test recoveries for clients, the instant recovery is pretty valuable because we can bring it up quick. And then if we do need to run the full rehydration, we can kick that off with the click of a button, right? Does it promote to production?
Yep, migrate to production.
Migrate. Thank you. Yeah. Cool. All right. So, and part of that though, with the instant recovery or full or even running backups, right, is making sure that these backups are clean. A lot of times we can see that there's dwell time with cyber attacks. Sometimes they can lie at rest for a few days or even a month before they finally kick off the attack. And an early warning sign could be being able to discover that your systems through the backups are infected, right?
Yes, yes. There's a lot of great features wrapped into that. So when we talk about malware scanning, since V12, Veeam has included YARA, Veeam Threat Hunter, and allows for the use of third-party antivirus scanning solutions as well. So if you turn this on, you have a slider scale for it. You can set the aggressiveness of it. And it will do inline scanning of your backups while you're backing them up. You'll get flag notifications, things like that, if it discovers anything in the inline process. And so on the backend side of it, during restores, you have the option to select to do scanning based on YARA rules or the internal Veeam Threat Hunter, or you can select a third party like Windows Defender or other ones if you have one. So say you have a third party, that's tried and true and you love that one to death and trust it, then maybe use that one, to secure the environment with. So it's the preferred one. The only caveat really with using a third party is it does route it outside the application to another app. And so that takes slightly longer, going outside the Veeam infrastructure.
Yeah. I can't wait to see the demo on this one.
Yeah, it's all good stuff.
And then, of course, there's the clean room scenario. In a clean room scenario, really, you're talking about a wide blast radius on your cyber attack. Potentially, your entire production infrastructure is offline. Imagine like it's a police crime scene with the police tape wrapped around it. You can't even access it. So you need an alternate site to recover into, and you need that site to be isolated because you don't know exactly what's been infected, how badly was or how deep was the attack, how many systems were maybe infected but not encrypted. And so you need this type of environment to start to stand the infrastructure up methodically and scan, rinse, and promote the systems back out into your DR production site. So, as we say, the clean room is a space that allows for comprehensive testing of your cyber resiliency and your DR plans. Obviously, you want to do this. You want to run through tabletop and DR exercises, incident response exercises, more so to understand how you're going to react when that event does happen. And obviously that's in an isolated DR bubble, so it's outside of your production. It won't affect your production infrastructure. And then the other part of this is the forensics analysis. The incident response team will need to come in and start to really sift through the data to understand how badly the infection is and start to clean systems and work through that. And that all needs to be segmented and isolated. I was talking to our Chief Information Security Officer, Scott, the other day, and I was like, "Hey, Scott, what's your top IR response tool? If you need to start recovering inside of a clean room." And he's like, initially we would use SentinelOne or CrowdStrike, one of those main MDR tools. And he described it for me as the goal is really for containment and microsegmentation of these systems that are infected. And potentially if it's something that you catch early with your front end security monitoring and tooling, you might be able to segment those systems off in prod and contain that and begin your recovery locally. But that's not always the case. Sometimes those tools fail or just misconfigurations, and the damage is much larger and wider. And you may have to take those systems offline. You may have to basically clone everything that you have there and drop it into an alternate hypervisor here in the clean room, or in a similar situation out in a public cloud like Amazon or Azure. It's different locations, but you still need a sandbox tenant environment. And then you start to look through your SIM, your security incident event monitoring tooling, and backtrack through the logging to understand where the event started. Maybe find patient zero. Um, and you would go back, and then at that point, it's going to help you to figure out what recovery point you need to start to look at for restoration processes. So the goal with logging is to see when things went south on you, and then use that as your recovery point objective. So there's no real solution here. It's no silver bullet, but it's part of the solution, part of the workflow for your response, and you really have to build the plan that works for your company. Another part of that, we show an example here of a cyber recovery workflow with Veeam as the example. And what you're looking at with this slide really is a virtual machine, number one, and you've got three different copies. You got copy A, which is a backup from 4 hours ago. You've got copy B, which is 3 days ago, and copy C is 2 weeks ago. So you can start with a workflow recovery process that could be similar to this inside of the clean room restoration. And you start with, I need the most data I can recover before 4 hours ago. Let's take a look at that. But you discover quickly that 4 hour ago copy is encrypted. It's useless. Copy B, you find it's infected, but it's not encrypted. And C is clean. You could use it, but you're going to lose 2 weeks worth of data, which could be substantial depending on what kind of business you run. So, being able to work through this process here and being able to report quickly and accurately, because people want to know what systems were infected and what's the closest point I can recover to. Also, just to call out, you really must scan. You must have that incident response plan in place, because it's dangerous to recover the wrong stuff and you don't check it, because you'll reinfect the entire system or the rest of the systems that you've already recovered. And of course, so what we're walking through here is the basics of a cyber resiliency program. And so let's jump into Eric's demonstration for instant recovery and malware scanning now.
All right, so before we start the recovery process here, we're going to make sure that malware scanning is enabled at the infrastructure level in Veeam. And to do that, you just go to the main menu, malware detection. If you haven't enabled it before, this checkbox will not be checked. So, and the first time that you check it, it's got to do a complete scan on the backup files itself. And basically what that means is next time you run your backup jobs, after this has been enabled, it's going to go through and scan it block for block. So that first set of jobs you run after enabling will take a little bit longer than typical. So that's the expectation around that, just so you know and you're aware. When we talk about the sensitivity level here, you have basically threefold on the scale. So you can set it to a low scanning, which will take longer to complete the jobs. But in that instance, what we would be looking for is maybe you have a VBR at a, like an off-site location or a small office location, and it doesn't have much horsepower. So the obvious choice for that would be to set the scanning for low. It defaults to normal with your typical VBR settings that you would spec out based on whatever your environment is. The normal setting will run within that pretty much, fine. If you wanted it to be further aggressive, you can set that to extreme. It'll try to process that stuff faster, but keep in mind that you're going to want a higher core count and a beefier box to manage that. The other pieces that are included here in the malware scanning is file detection. And what that means is it does it based on guest OS. So if you have a backup job and you have application aware set up so that it knows about those applications and also has access to the guest OS, it will do file system scanning within that guest OS. By default, it tries to enable these, so keep that in mind. If you don't want your guest OS files scanned, you would uncheck these boxes here. The other piece of this is signature detection. And this is where you have two choices. You can allow Veeam to use the built-in, which is called Veeam Threat Hunter. That's internal to Veeam and their scanning engine. Or you can set your own option for third-party scanning. So if you have something that is tried and true and you know that it's rock solid and you prefer to use that, this is where you would set that option. The only caveat to keep in mind is with a third-party scanner, it's not built in, so it has to send that data to another application, and so that's going to take a little bit longer than using the internal scan. This incident API tab is where, so if you were doing some scanning and YARA picked something up and flagged it, you could check this box in here so that automatically it would go ahead and make a isolated copy of that for further review through your own scanning tools, or if you needed to send that off to a third party for them to scan it and determine what's going on. Notifications are also part of the process, so you have the ability to alert via email or email groups anytime any of that's detected, so you can go and investigate that further. Once it flags it here, it'll also have it in a malware section in Veeam, and you can just go to that malware detection setting and see, kind of in a list of what it was that it detected, and then you can move on from there and how you want to handle it. So we have it enabled. We look good here. The second part of this that is also a benefit is another tool in the tool set here that Veeam's added in, and it's the 4eyes authorization. And it's kind of a interesting name for the feature, right? But it's actually a pretty solid feature, and you can think of it kind of like a 2FA scenario where there's a two-factor part of the process here. So if you had, say, a restore operator that accidentally deleted something, or you had something more malicious like ransomware that went out and issued a delete via APIs, what would happen with this option enabled is it would go out and then it would send a request to another administrator or a group of administrators that you've pre-identified. So if you go in here and say, hey, I want to delete this backup, it doesn't delete the backup at that time. It sends out a request to another administrator that you've already set to pre-approve that before it's deleted. So it's just another mechanism to prevent, unauthorized deletions or prevent errors in deletions. So now that we've covered those two options, we'll kind of step through the instant restore functionality. And we're going to go over here, and these are where all our backups are housed. I'm going to select the one that I want to use here. Say this guy here. We'll do an instant recovery. You can see that the VM's in there. I'm going to restore this to an alternate location so that it doesn't overwrite the existing. We'll give it a new appended name here. I like to redirect the write cache, and what that means is, so we're doing an instant recovery, and that's going to come out of the backup files. It's going to boot out of the backup files, but when that boots, it's going to have change blocks associated with it. It needs a place to store those change blocks from the boot process or anything that you happen to do in the OS past the point of those backups, right? So our delta, our changes. If you do not change this here, it will typically default to whatever that cache setting is, or it was that when you installed it. Most of the time it's your C drive. I like a little bit more space when it comes to these type of things, so I've selected this data store here just based on space. This is where we would define the scanning. If you enable these options here, this one in particular will try to make use of the guest file indexing that we talked about, and so that function there is going to scan your internal guest OS files. And when we say that, what happens in that process is it's similar to how you would do a file level restore, FLR restore. It will go and it'll mount that VMDK, make it accessible in a read-only function, and then go in and proceed to scan those files individually at a granular level. Veeam Threat Hunter is the built-in AV that we talked about. And so the secondary option is also to scan using rules. And you can do either or both. When we talk about scanning with YARA rules, what that means is you have a couple predefined rules that are in here. You do have the ability to add third-party rules or customize rules. You have to add them preemptively in another section. But from within here, the basic rules are hash parameters and find string. And so by hash, what that means is it's going to search based on the hash of that actual file or known file. If it detects anything outside of the hash, it'll let you know. Parameters is kind of self-explanatory. If it matches any sort of parameters that are similar to or identical to ransomware, it'll flag it. And then find based on string would be a text string within a file. So if you have, say, a text file or relatively any file and it has a text string in it, it's matched to known ransomware, it's going to flag based on that as well. And so within here, we would normally select by hash. I like using that one. It seems to be a little bit faster than some of the others. For the purposes of this demo, we're not going to enable this because it'll take a bit of time to run through that. So we also have these options on, well, if it does find something, what do we want it to do with it? You can proceed with recovery, but disable network adapters, which basically brings the VM up, but leaves it network isolated so that you can manage it with it up, but isolated from the rest of your environment. The other option is to abort the VM recovery completely, which would be, oh, it found malware. We don't want to put that in the environment at all. So just stop what you're doing and it doesn't restore anything. The other option, depending on if you wanted to continue scanning, say it found that first instance and you wanted it to, kind of track any other instances within those file sets. So you could tell it to continue scanning on all the remaining files, even after the first occurrence of malware was detected. For now, like I said, we're not going to enable that just based on time. But if you were to enable that, the understanding is it'll kick off that process before it does any rehydration or booting. It goes through and it does the complete scan, gives you a log of kind of what it's doing in there. You'll see where it scans your C drive or any other drives that are attached to that. And it'll either say threat identified or there is no threat. Typically, we'd expect no threat unless there's some sort of instance that was already flagged and we're doing follow-up on that. So we'll go ahead and continue here, start that incident recovery job. And so while it's going through this process, we'll talk about a few of the other things here, specifically related to immutability. So if we look at our repositories versus our retention points, a lot of the confusion that happens with those two numbers is typically people will just assume, well, my retention points are set at 30, so that must mean that my immutability is also set at 30. Well, not necessarily the case. So when we talk about Linux hardened repositories or LHR, the default is 7 days. So out of the box, when you first configure that, it's set for 7 days. And that's a flat, right? We can't roll that down anymore. 7 days is the absolute minimum that you can set on an immutability retention for LHR. You can obviously scale that up, but you can't scale it down any further than 7 days. So what that means is, let's say that you needed an immutable, backup for 3 days, right? So at that point, you still won't be able to delete that backup for 10 because the retention on that, or the immutability period versus retention, is 7 days. So you would have to wait that 7 days and then on the 8th day be able to delete that. And you can see that setting here won't allow me to roll it back any further. When we talk about S3, the caveat with S3 is the block generation period. And on most in-house things or devices that you would buy from vendors, it's a 10-day block generation period versus, say, AWS, that's a 30-day block generation period. And so what we need to keep in mind with S3 and object locking is that period. And so they build that period in specifically because it wants to reduce the IO load that's on that device. And What that really means is, so if we have a bunch of backups that expire, or there's a bunch of deletes that happen at the same time, it builds in that period for the garbage collection on the device itself, to kind of minimize that IO hit on the front end, or your production data, or your writes, versus the deletes. And so that's why that block generation period is put in there, but it's 10 days, which means if you have 30 days of immutability, you're going to still have that 10-day block generation period that you have to take in consideration, as well as far as the immutability period. And we'll just kind of step through here and I'll show you where that setting is. And keep in mind that your retention point period is not the same as your immutability period. So immutability is set on the repo level, where we're looking at here, and you can see by default, I can roll that down, obviously, much lower than the one that is set on LHR, but it does have the block generation period, like I said, that you have to consider. And so where that varies is our retention points are set in the job. And from that job, typically what you want to do, it's best practice to make those match. So if you have 30 days of retention, you probably want 30 days of immutability as well, so those match. So if you were to have, say, 7 days of LHR and you don't change that there, but you set to have retention for 30 days, only that first 7 days is going to be actual immutable. So it leaves you kind of exposed on those other points unless you make them match. So let's kind of move back here. And we can see our incident recovery is done, and it's been mounted here. So we'll be able to go in and take a look. And this is the one that we restored, and you can see here that it's up and running and ready to go. The caveat here, like I said, is this is booted out of backup files. So while it only took a few minutes to bring up, you will take an IO hit on that until it's completely converted. But, you know, in an emergency situation where it's more important to have the machine up than it is, you know, to take a little bit of a hit on the IO, this is most definitely the way that you're going to want to go about it. So now that we've done that, the next stage in the process, if this was production, you would come in here and we would say migrate to production. And so on the underside of that, or what it'll be doing in the background, is basically a VM, you know, storage vMotion. And, you know, it'll take, you know, what it takes depending on the size of that, with this one being, you know, roughly about 200 gig in size. And so it's probably 10, 15 minutes to finish it, but that'll scale, obviously, you know, based on the size of your VMDKs. Another feature of this, if you just needed to use it for testing, this is really the way to go about that as well. Or if you wanted to do a granular file level restore of something, say like a database, and you only really needed that one file out of there, so you would boot it up, go in and copy your file out that you needed. And then when you were done with it, you can come in here and all you need to do is tell it to stop publishing. So we'll go through that now. And once you stop publishing it, it's going to tear all this down and clean it up. And it's really a good feature for space saving. Say that you didn't want to, you know, just write the entire VM to that VM infrastructure and take up all that space. You could run it out of backup, get the files you need, or likewise test it within that environment and then just tear it down when you're done. As you can see, that's gone away now. And it's also gone out of our vCenter. That's what we have for today on the demo. I appreciate all you guys joining. Thanks.
That was an awesome demonstration. Thanks, Eric.
Yep.
So partnering with Recovery Point, we are experts in implementing Veeam solutions, and we are dedicated support to ensure that your data resilience and business continuity is available to you. And thank you for your time.